Actually, you touched a number of things that, one, I agree with, and two, so I don't have to repeat them, so very good. So my chapter talked about, supposed to talk about space and imperative for it as a geopolitical objective. And so start with by breaking down that what we're really debating here is really the future of human spaceflight. Because if you look at the other sectors of space activity, national security, commercial, even a lot of civil unmanned activities, scientific activities, there's perfectly reasonable justifications for each of those activities. So the sciences have decadal surveys, military has national security requirements, even the things like weather monitoring and climate science all have their rationale for them. So they're all facing a number of very serious problems, shortages of funding, difficult priorities, gaps in constellations, we know all that. But those problems are primarily programmatic problems. They're problems of management, they're problems of priorities, they're problems of allocating resources against risks. It's really in human spaceflight that you have existential problems. Now among spaceflight people, you say to them, the answer is human spaceflight, what was the question? Yet that asking of what is the question regarding human spaceflight, I think, is part of the major motivation for this book. Now, the early human space exploration activities were, as many of my students know, is the result of President Kennedy asking a question. Is there anything anywhere where we can beat the Russians in space? And assessments that things such as building a space station or even putting up a three-man vehicle were all things where we did not have really an edge. It was the moon that was so difficult that we and the Soviets were pretty much in the same position. So it was the moon where we had a chance of beating the Russians, yet at the same time was something that we thought was physically possible. So the moon and the Apollo program was an answer to a political question. We haven't had that kind of focused political question for a long time. We've had some smaller ones, which I'll touch on really in a moment. The options for going forward that one could look at for motivations for human spaceflight break, in my mind, into three areas: capability-driven, question-driven, and geopolitically driven. Jim has done a good job of describing capability-driven. I would say that capability-driven has happened once before in the U.S. Program, and that's with the Space Shuttle program. In the case of the Space Shuttle, President Nixon didn't really want to shut down human spaceflight, didn't want to be responsible for ending that, nor did he make a positive decision as to what it was for. So the space task groups that came out with all kinds of wonderful ideas for going on to the moon, eventually onto Mars, building a space station, all of that was left on the cutting room floor. The only thing left standing was, of course, the Space Shuttle program. So the Space Shuttle was created as a capability without defining what it was supposed to be for. And in fact, much of the final endgame arguments with OMB were over rather artificial arguments over cost effectiveness, how many flights would you get, which led to policies that it had to capture really pretty much every known U.S. payload as well as 70% of the world market share before you started to make a dent in the cost effectiveness. Totally missing the unique technical capabilities that shuttle was bringing to bear in terms of returning payloads from orbit, satellite servicing, on-orbit repair, all kinds of other stuff that was really unvalued. There were some interesting discussions about how you could make payloads cheaper by using the shuttle, but that was, I should say probably gently, was rather speculative. So we had a shuttle program really without a decision as to what it would do. It was really a negative decision not to stop human spaceflight rather than something to be for. Now, the Nixon administration did, however, did make a manned spaceflight decision that was in a positive vein trying to accomplish something, and that was Apollo-Soyuz. Apollo-Soyuz came out of the Nixon-Brezhnev conversations. It was meant to symbolize détente with the Soviet Union, or at least a period of détente. If you look at later decisions to build the space station program, initially that was in order to bind together countries who were developing major space capabilities, Europe, Japan, Canada, and to bring them together as part of an anti-Soviet coalition, again during the Cold War. The decision of the Clinton administration to bring the Russians into the space station program was part of a geopolitical objective symbolizing a post-Soviet relationship that we wanted to have with Russia. And so again, human spaceflight was used as a means to serve other larger national interests. Now, Jim brought up the idea of capability, of a question-driven approach, and one can look at the scientific community and see that the astrophysics, heliophysics, planetary science, earth science people put together nice prioritized lists of activities that they'd like to do. These tend to be very popular not only with the national academies, but they tend to be popular here on the Hill. And the reason is because members of Congress don't have to try to understand what the scientists are saying, because the scientists have gone and thrashed out among themselves what those priorities are. I mean, the worst thing to do is to come to a member and to tell them, my science is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you should fund me and not those other guys. You know, a member goes, what am I supposed to do with that? So having a process by which the scientific community sorts out priorities among itself is really a rather clever one. But this depends on that community having a sense of self-organization and actually being willing to sanction people who violate or go outside of that process. As one of my former bosses said, the problem with human spaceflight is everyone with an IQ greater than a grain of wheat thinks they're an expert on human spaceflight. Whereas we know that doesn't happen with astrophysics or earth science or planetary science and so forth, because those are well-defined communities. Human spaceflight touches on such a broader variety of human interest and activity that it's really hard to get them together. Now, you can come up with prioritized questions in the way that Jim mentioned, and things such as, can you live off the land, where can humans go, what can they do? Those are things that you could put into a question-driven agenda to answer. It falls short, however, because the kinds of monies that you're talking about are so large and the things you need to do are so difficult that it's hard to sustain a focus beyond multiple political administrations. The only way to sustain a focus across multiple decades is to make sure your program, particularly human spaceflight, is aligned with enduring national interests that are there regardless of what political party is in power, who controls the House or Senate, or who's in the White House. It's alignment of space activity, particularly human space activity, with enduring national interests in a geopolitical manner that I believe has the most promise for actually accomplishing and sustaining human spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit. So if you look at what those kind of objectives might be, how is today different than when the Apollo program was first done? Well, of course, it's very different because space is a much more globalized world. There are many, many more countries involved in space today than there were back in the 60s or even the 70s. It's also different in that our unmanned capabilities are much more important to us than they were even in the 1960s. We have, Marshall has had these sessions about, a day without space and so forth to make that point. We are probably among the most space-reliant nation in the world. Our economy, our national security, even our scientific activities, our contributions to international organizations. So we are critically interested in whether or not the space environment stays stable, calm, peaceful. We have a great strategic interest in this. As some folks from the DoD have commented, that it's hard to imagine, not impossible, but hard to imagine any country intentionally going up against U.S. armed forces in terms of the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines. But space and cyberspace are the two new areas where you can imagine a country thinking, maybe I have a shot today. So the issue of deterrence in space or cyberspace is something I won't go into here, is well discussed in other regions. How could we align our interests in security areas, in national security and foreign policy, and having a more stable and secure world with our interest in a long-term and sustaining human spaceflight program? How could human spaceflight serve those interests? I think that they can by involving other countries in a large program, just as we involve countries with us with the International Space Station. One can imagine involving and working with other emerging space powers, notably India and China, not on the space station program, but on the next steps farther out, which to my mind are the moon. The moon has something that asteroids and Mars do not, which is that they are accessible to countries at varying levels of development. When the 2010 space policy came out, I was overseas at these IAF conferences in Prague, and I had a number of Asian Space Agency people come to me and ask me whether the president was really serious about international cooperation. And I said, well, yeah, he says he is. And their frank comment to me unofficially was, well, we don't believe so. I go, really? Why would you say that? He says, well, you picked goals about Mars and asteroids that we can't do. So maybe you want to cooperate with the Russians, but you don't really want to cooperate with us because you picked goals that you knew we couldn't do. We can't go back to our finance ministries and say we're going to do a manned space program, to Phobos and Deimos, whereas we could do the moon. The moon was difficult. It was challenging. You may have done it, but we haven't. And we see a number of ways where we could participate. If you're an economist, you start talking about different price points. The moon architecture has a number of different price points you can enter at, everything from the really high end, go build a lunar base, to maybe running a small rover on the surface. So the opportunities for international cooperation are actually much broader there. The opportunities for commercial involvement are also much broader there. One can imagine, for example, sending commercial cargo vehicles to the moon to deliver resources to the lunar surface, creating a larger addressable market than delivering to the space station could be done. It's hard to imagine commercial participation other than maybe brand identification for things like asteroids and Mars missions. That's not to say that asteroid and Mars missions are not technically interesting, that they're not scientifically sort of valid, but they have a harder road to hoe in terms of aligning themselves with enduring national interests in the way that a lunar program would in terms of getting both commercial and international people involved and interested with you. Among the many flaws and mistakes that I think this administration has made in space, I think that the international side and the neglect of geopolitical interests has probably been the most severe, at least in the space community. This is not limited to human spaceflight, of course. You can look at the experience of ExoMars, which by no means was a perfect program and had a number of its own challenges and problems with it, so it wouldn't have necessarily been a slam dunk to have been accomplished. But turning down our European partners and giving them no choice but to go to the Russians is not something that I thought of as particularly internationally wise. Abandoning the moon and giving our partners really no place to go except to maybe try to set up separate deals with each other also struck me as unwise. And so in this environment where the U.S. has somewhat faded from the scene, other countries are stepping into the vacuum. We recently had the IAF conference in Beijing, and the Chinese did a very, very nice job with it. They displayed their Shenzhou capsule. They had a number of exhibits showing cooperation between, say, South Africa and China, between Brazil and China. Of course, there's a long history, although the Brazilians just lost a satellite on that. And what you could see there is that if the United States was to disappear from the scene, to do a thought experiment, as Eric suggested, there would still be a global space community. There would be a global space community doing science, communications, navigation, even human spaceflight. But it wouldn't necessarily be a global space community with the Americans necessarily being present. And now, among some space enthusiasts, the answer might be, well, that's regrettable, but humanity is humanity, and onward we go. I think this would be a tragedy. This would be a tragedy because, while I don't mind the Chinese being in space, I don't want them there without me. And the reason for this is not purely egotism, it's values. I think that if we're looking at aligning and promoting our geopolitical interests, it is not merely because we're nationalistic and prideful, but because we think we have values that are important and transcendent to the world. Values of a liberal, tolerant culture, of a democratic society, of a mixed market economy, respect for human rights. That these are the values that if there is going to be a human future in space, we should be promoting and taking with us and incorporating and involving other like-minded countries who want to associate themselves with Western civilization should be promoting. So it is not a matter of indifference as to who is on the space frontier, because the rules in space are set by those people who show up, not by those who stay behind. And so if we're going to shape that world, given our dependence on space for our own self-interest, and given that we believe still in the values that we espouse, then it is not a matter of indifference as to who leads on that frontier. And therefore, we have to think about, well, what can our partners possibly do? What are they willing to do? What are they able to do? We need to actually talk with them more. So that will hopefully be happening next month in the ISEF conference, and there's other number of venues where this goes on. But that has to be followed up with actions if we're going to pursue our own interests. If I might simply sort of end with, I look forward to some of the discussions that in talking and working with our other partners, it's important that we discuss some of these broader range interests and not simply focus on individual missions. Recently I've been asked about things like, the asteroid retrieval mission, or about the Inspiration Mars missions and all these sorts of things. And so there's no shortage of exciting and interesting things out there to do. And while I can talk through, say, the technical merits and engineering merits of each of these missions, they're both lacking something. They're both lacking a larger context into why we're doing them and what you would do after they were done. I completely agree with Jim about the folly of focusing solely on a destination, despite my comments about the moon as the next destination. Because my destination is not the moon. My destination is making sure that first, cislunar space is, to the degree it can be, an American lake upon which others are also free to sail. It's an environment in which our interests are promoted, to which we are not a hegemon, but are the central, indispensable nation in human exploration, such that we lead in the values on the space frontier. So a destination need not be a physical one. A destination can be a policy one, a geopolitical one, one of values that I believe is more sustainable and more enduring than any particular political party would maybe have you believe. Thank you.